Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I have a review for you that I should have filmed in March because that was when I finished the series, but I was lazy. I pushed it out and out and out, and now we're 3 to 4 months later and I'm finally sitting down. Although with this series it's a lot less problematic for me to wait so long to film the review compared to, you know, other books, because this is a series that I have reread, so I am familiar with everything and I still know what I want to talk about and so on, compared to if I talk about newer books or if I read newer books and wait very long to film the review. I might forget some things that I wanted to talk about. But anyway, the series I'm talking about, or rather two trilogies I'm talking about, is the Hythrun Chronicles, which consists of the trilogy that is the Demon Child trilogy, as well as the Wolfblade trilogy. Which, by the way, it doesn't make sense that now the entirety of these books is called the Hythrun Chronicles. When I first read them, only the Wolfblade trilogy was called the Hythrun Chronicles, and the majority of the Demon Child trilogy isn't even set within Hydria, which is one of the countries within this world. So why would you call the entirety of this the Hythrun Chronicles if the second book, or the first series actually the first series, like not chronologically but publication wise, wasn't even set in Hydria? It does not make sense. Who decided to do that? But anyway, that was a little rant, and that was all my books falling down. But actually all the books that I don't need right now, because I am of course going to review both series separately, and I do want to start with the Demon Child trilogy. So this trilogy consists of the first book, which is Medalon, the second book, which is Trezen Keep, and the third book, which is Harshini. And I am gonna put these books down because first of all they're the German copies, and second of all they're really fucking heavy. And this series is one of my very old-time favorites. It was one of the first adult high fantasy series that I ever read. I think it was among the first 3 that I ever read. I was 12 years old when I first read it, and I reread it multiple times up until I was about 17, 18. I think I've probably read the entirety of this series 5 times already, probably. I mean, the Demon Child trilogy less than the other one, the Wolfblade trilogy, but my point is I read it a lot. However, I haven't reread it in a few years, and so I decided to pick it up this year and see if it holds up. So the Demon Child trilogy, as I said, was the first published series. The other trilogy is a prequel trilogy, but I'll get to that later. And so we're set in this world where there's gods that exist. However, there's a new god on the rise that kind of threatens the old ones. And then there's also another interesting element, because the majority of this is set in a country where people don't believe that the gods actually exist. And so yeah, new god on the rise threatens the old ones, and so the only one who can stop that person, the only one who can kill a god, is the Demon Child. And that is the main character that we follow. The Demon Child is a person created. It's kind of a chosen one story, but also not really, because there's not really a prophecy involved. The Demon Child was specifically created by the gods for the reason to kill that new god. And so yeah, we're following the main character Rushil, who obviously is said Demon Child. Surprise. And yeah, we follow her as she first of all comes to terms with growing up not believing that there are gods, but suddenly there are gods, but also kind of just having to deal with this huge mission that is on her shoulders. So yeah, that's it as a summary. Now let's get into the review. As always, my reviews, both of them, will be spoiler free, and we're gonna start with negative things about this series. The first thing I have to say is that in certain elements of the series, this is a very typically early 2000s series, because that was when it was published. What I mean by that is that it's mainly very white and straight, but that's just what fantasy at the time was, sadly. So yeah, just be aware of that. You're not gonna get great representation when you go into this book. But to be honest, when I pick up early 2000s fantasy, that's not really what I'm looking for anyway. Although I also do have to say that in this series, while there are no queer characters, homosexuality is mentioned, and not necessarily always in a derogatory way. So yeah, do appreciate that. It's something that I've actually on my rereads noticed a lot of early 2000s fantasy written by women do. Like, fantasy by men never see a mention of queerness anywhere, at least not explicitly, but even if it's just a throwaway sentence, like, female authors at least acknowledge that that exists, which to a certain degree I do appreciate. So yeah, it's just something interesting that I've seen. So the other big negative for me, and the reason why I actually enjoyed this series less than the prequel trilogy, which I'll get to later, is that I'm not the biggest fan of our two main characters. I mean, Rashil is really the main character, but I'm also not the biggest fan of the male character that plays the biggest role, at least in the first book, who is Tarja. Tarja annoys the fuck out of me. I don't know, there's something about him. Every reread that I've had, I've liked him less and less. I remember really loving him when I first read the series, but right now I can't with him. So, and then on the other hand, you have Rashil, who I do think is a very, very interesting character, and certainly a very unique female main character, because she doesn't really fit your typical, like, I don't know how to say it, your typical tropes. She's not really the strong female character trope, she's not the princess trope, and she's very flawed. She is a main character who is incredibly angry and has so much anger inside of her for good reasons though, because first of all, her mother has always mistreated her and treated her as a pawn, and then suddenly she tries to kind of get a grip of her life and to get some self-determination, and now suddenly she's the pawn of these gods that she has never believed in. And it's just a really interesting dynamic, and you so rarely get to see a female character who is just allowed to be angry, who is allowed to not be good. And so I do think she's an incredibly interesting character. I still don't like her though. So yeah, I guess it's a positive and a negative kind of in a way, but yeah, Rashil definitely is a very interesting character, and she tests your patience a lot. Something else I don't like quite as much about this series compared to the other series is that parts of the plot feel very repetitive. There's certain elements to the plot that happen again and again and again, and like 2 or 3 times in every book, and I'm just like, can't we just move on from this? Like, why do we have to go through this once again? And then something that's just negative for me on a reread is that for my favorite characters, I have to wait for the second and third book for them to really play a role, and they don't really appear all that much in the first book. So that's just something that I find a little bit sad, except for one of my favorite characters who's just, oh my god, I love Breckendarren so much. But yeah, now for the positive stuff, and I will try to keep this rather brief so that we then have time to get into the second series. But first of all, I do really appreciate a lot of the characters. Like, just from a character design standpoint, I guess. Like, one of the villains is just one of those characters that you just love to hate, and he's just such a petty person, and he's such a coward. But because he's such a coward, he's just incredibly cruel, and I just think he's a really well done villain. The only thing I would criticize about him is that sometimes his cruelty is shown by him raping women, and we all know I don't really like that all too much. However, it's never graphic, it's kind of just, you know, not even fade to black. It's never graphic, but it's something that I just don't appreciate. Although in general, in terms of sexual assault, trigger warnings, there is a sexual assault scene. I mean, isn't really, because I actually only realized this time around when rereading it that one of the characters actually was raped, and it wasn't just a threat of rape, because it's just like that non-graphic. And we then spend a lot more time afterwards with the fallout of the rape on the character and what that does to her. And that's something that I once again appreciate. Like, sexual assault, rape is a very tricky subject in books in general, and yeah, it can be hard. But yeah, other characters, side characters, I think I love every single one of the side characters. And I really love all the like villains as well. It's just so well done. Then world building wise, I also really love this one. I think I love the world building, or the focus of the world building of this series actually more than for the Wolfblade trilogy, which I think this is the one thing where I prefer this one, because in this series you just get a lot more of a focus on the way the different countries in this world interact. You basically have 4 different countries, and Hydria we don't get to see that much. Fredonia we do get to see a little bit, but we mostly concentrate on Carrion and Medallon. Medallon is a country that's really interesting because it's led by this sisterhood and it's led by women. It's a matriarchal society. I mean, also not really, because I don't feel on a societal level it's all that matriarchal, but in any case it's a country that's led by a sisterhood, and so I really appreciated that part. That brought a lot of interesting elements into it. Also really interesting how the one country in this world that does not believe there is gods or a god is the one country that is led by women, and that is very much not sexist towards women, which all 3 of the other countries are. And then Carrion is a kind of stereotypical Christian country, Christian fundamentalist country. And yeah, but there's also really interesting elements there. And yeah, overall I really enjoy the series. I thought on a reread it did hold up well enough. Would I still call it one of my all-time favorites? No, probably not. But, you know, I still really enjoyed my reread, and I still think it's a book that's worth picking up. So, or a series that's worth picking up. So now let's continue on to the Hythrun Chronicle. So where the Demon Child trilogy was very magic and Chosen One and fantasy tropes focused, the Hythrun Chronicles is a lot more of a political fantasy. There are some elements that are magical, but most of it concentrates on the political aspects. This series in its entirety pretty much is set within one of the countries in this world, Hydria, and we follow the Princess of Hydria, who is the sister to the, what's it called? Not Grand Duke, but to the High Prince, that was it. She's the sister to the High Prince, to the ruler of Hydria. The High Prince, for reasons, probably won't get an heir. And so Maala's life, Maala's hand in marriage, pretty much is his biggest political, like, bargaining chip. And so at the beginning of the series, she still is very much starry-eyed and she wants to find her one true love and so on. But she very quickly has to learn that that's just not what life has to offer to her. And so yeah, we follow her as she becomes more and more politically savvy and as she just tries to keep her family safe. So first, negative things. The negative things are mostly things that are less to do with the story itself. Although when it comes to the story, there are some parts within the story, some POVs that I just wasn't as interested in, that I didn't really feel like they added anything or all that much to the story. But mostly my negative things are in terms of world building and representation. The first thing is that within this country, slavery is normal. However, slavery isn't like chattel slavery, and it's also not working slaves, not all that much, but most of what we see from slavery is courtesa. And courtesa are basically social slaves. I don't know how else to say it. On the one hand, they are the handmaidens, they are the servants and everything for the nobility. On the other hand, a lot of courtesa are also of the sexual variety and are there to serve their masters. Which of course, all the good guys in this world aren't really all that cruel towards their Kurtesa, but there's also instances where owners are very cruel. And so the thing that I find a little bit negative is that that is never questioned, and like even the main characters, the good guys, never question the righteousness of slavery, and it's just a thing that's there, and you know, it's just there. And I think it makes sense within the story why none of them would question it, but it's also still something that kind of makes you go, yeah, I like you maybe a little bit less because of that now. So yeah, that's one of the negatives within the world building of this. The other thing is that the one canon queer character is of course a pervert and a sadist. So yeah, you have that. However, I do have to add that it is never framed in a way within this series that perversion and sadism and cruelty has anything to do with his queerness. He just happens to be both. Like, for example, at another point later in the series, you have the main male character and he's asked if he is into guys, and he is not attacked in his masculinity at all because he's asked that. He just reacts normally. He's like, yeah, I mean, nah, doesn't really float my boat all that much. So yeah, I do appreciate it where it's framed that queerness isn't necessarily something negative, but then also you have the one queer character who is one of the most despicable characters in the series. So yeah, just wanted to mention it. But yeah, aside from those, I think I already mentioned that there's a few passages that kind of bored me a little bit that I didn't think fit all that much. Also in terms of connecting the two series, I don't know if I mentioned it already, but this is the prequel series, so this is set before the other series. And in terms of connecting the two series, there were some hiccups here and there. So there were some parts where it's like, I don't know, these mystical beings are kind of characterized a little bit different in both series, or this person suddenly being like this and acting like this doesn't make sense. There seems to be some inconsistencies and so on, but it's minor cosmetic stuff, so not that big of an issue. So aside from that, the positives, once again, the characters. I think Jennifer Fallon has some of the most interesting female main characters. Maaaaaaybe is another one of those very, very interesting main characters, because where she starts the series and where she ends the series is completely different and like not at all the same person. And so you have Maaaaaaybe's character arc, which is just so well done and so beautifully done, and she starts off as the very naive person and ends the series as one of the most feared political people ever, and it's so well done. She becomes so ruthless and heartless, all to save her family, so I love that. Also, Dammon Wolfblade is like one of my favorite characters ever. I love him so much. He is one of the characters that also appears in the second series, or the first series, I guess. But aside from that, also I just love the political aspects. I found them very well done and very interesting. I mean, parts of the series, part of the setup of the series does feel a little bit like A Song of Ice and Fire, but it's kind of like the Wheel of Time, where also a lot of the setup from the first book feels basically like the Lord of the Rings, but it then turns into its own thing, and that's the case here as well. And yeah, I just think it's so well written, there's so much tension, it's so interesting, there's so many elements that play into it, and yet it's not as expensive as A Song of Ice and Fire. So this is definitely always a series if you're interested in a Game of Thrones, but if you're still a little bit intimidated, to pick this series up. So I guess that's also where I kind of maybe want to talk about whether or not you can read this series without having read the Demon Child trilogy. And I think generally, yes. There are some elements, especially when it comes to the magic, that I feel are underexplained in this series on its own, where you maybe need to read the Demon Child trilogy first to completely understand it. but I still think the series would stand well enough on its own as well. So yeah, if you made it to this point, tell me in the comments down below if you're interested in picking up this series. Also, if you have read the series and watched this video for some reason, tell me what your thoughts are on the books. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. Also, all the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, will read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will also be left in the description box down below, so go and check those out as well. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!